White bank manager declines black woman's check, not realizing she owns the bank. The scent of freshly brewed coffee hung faintly in the air, mingling with the antiseptic chill of air conditioning as Capital Crest Bank opened its doors to another day. The pristine lobby, a sea of polished marble and gleaming brass, buzzed with the quiet hum of transactions. Employees in crisp uniforms shuffled papers, greeted clients, and tapped keyboards with practiced ease. Reginald Thorpe stood at his usual post behind the counter, his sharp navy suit a testament to his meticulousness. At 53, with graying temples and a face hardened by years of balancing books and following protocols, Reginald had long ago convinced himself that he was a pillar of order in a chaotic world. Today, he told himself, would be no different. Then, she walked in. Amara Samakwi's entrance was marked by the soft clack of her heels on the marble floor. Heads turned, as they always did when she entered a room. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was stunning with her deep mahogany skin and sharp, regal features. It was her presence, a commanding air that spoke of confidence and power. Her tailored emerald green pantsuit hugged her tall, athletic frame, and the braided crown of her hair shimmered under the sunlight streaming through the glass facade. She approached the counter, her movements deliberate, her gaze unflinching. The young teller, Evelyn, glanced up nervously, fumbling with her pen before straightening in her seat. "Good morning," Amar greeted, sliding a cashier's check across the counter. Her voice was smooth, rich, and calm, but there was an edge beneath it, a quiet strength that left no room for dismissal. Evelyn's eyes darted to the check. Her breath caught as she registered the amount, $250,000. She hesitated, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, she rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. One moment, please," Evelyn stammered before hurrying off toward Reginald, who was reviewing a transaction at the far end of the counter. Amara stood still, her eyes sweeping the room. She noted the glances from other clients, the subtle shifts in posture as they tried and failed not to stare. She was used to this. The scrutiny, the whispers, the quiet, suffocating judgment. Evelyn returned moments later, accompanied by Reginald, whose face carried the carefully neutral expression of a man who prided himself on professionalism. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice measured and polite. He extended a hand toward the check, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he examined it. "I understand you're here to deposit this." "Yes," Amar replied, meeting his gaze. Her tone was steady, her expression unreadable. Reginald glanced at the check again, his eyes lingering on the name, Samakwi Holdings, LLC. He cleared his throat. "This is a substantial amount," he said, his tone teetering on the edge of skepticism. "Do you have an account with us?" Amara's lips curved into a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been a client here for over 5 years," she said. "You're welcome to verify that." Reginald nodded, motioning for Evelyn to check the account. The young teller's fingers danced across the keyboard, her nervous energy palpable. After a moment, she looked up and nodded. "Yes, Mr. Thorpe," Evelyn said. "Miss Samakwi has an active account. Everything seems to be in order." Reginald frowned slightly, his gaze flickering between Amara and the check. "I'd like to confirm the source of this check," he said after a pause. "It's standard procedure for transactions of this size." Amara's smile faded. She straightened, her posture exuding quiet authority. "The source is my business," she said. "Samakwi Holdings. If you'd like to verify it, feel free to contact the issuing bank." There was a beat of silence. Reginald's jaw tightened, and he nodded curtly. "Excuse me for a moment," he said before disappearing into his office. Amara watched him go, her expression impassive, but inside, her thoughts churned. Here we go again. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The soft murmur of conversations around her faded into the background as her patience began to wane. She shifted her weight, her fingers drumming lightly against the counter. Why is it always like this? She wondered, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. Why do I always have to prove myself? Reginald returned after nearly 20 minutes, his face unreadable. Miss Macquie, he began, his tone carefully neutral. The check appears valid, but due to the amount, I'll need to place a hold before processing the deposit. It's standard procedure. Amara's eyes narrowed. A hold? My account has more than enough funds to cover this check. Why would that be necessary? It's just a precaution, Reginald said, his voice firm but not unkind. For your security and the bank's. Amara tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. Is that so? She said softly. Or is it because you don't believe I belong here? The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for too long. Reginald's face flushed, but he quickly composed himself. That's not what I meant, he said, his voice stiff. Then what did you mean? Amara pressed, her voice calm but unyielding. Reginald opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he drew a sharp breath and said, If you'd like to discuss this further, I can call my supervisor. Amara's smile returned, cold and precise. Yes, she said. I think that would be best. Reginald nodded stiffly and walked away, his shoulders rigid. Amara watched him go, her expression unreadable. Inside, her frustration boiled, but she forced herself to remain composed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. They'll learn soon enough, she thought. This bank is mine. As Reginald disappeared into the back office to summon his supervisor, the quiet hum of the bank's activities seemed to amplify. Amara stood rooted at the counter, her spine straight and her chin held high. She had spent a lifetime perfecting this posture, the quiet strength that spoke louder than words. Behind her, the murmurs of other patrons buzzed like static. A middle-aged woman in a floral blouse nudged her companion, whispering just loud enough to be heard. Wonder what's taking so long? Must be something suspicious. Amara resisted the urge to turn around. She had endured enough of these moments to know they weren't worth the energy. Instead, she let her gaze wander across the room, taking in the polished surfaces, the muted tones, and the carefully curated aura of professionalism. It was a facade, one she had paid for literally and figuratively. Her thoughts flickered to the journey that had brought her here. Years of sacrifice, relentless ambition, and late nights spent building some Macquie holdings from a single venture into a sprawling empire. She had signed the papers to acquire Capital Crest Bank 6 months ago, a strategic move to expand her portfolio. Yet here she was, treated as if she were a stranger, as if her presence were an anomaly to be scrutinized. The door to the back office creaked open, breaking her train of thought. Reginald emerged, followed by a woman who exuded authority with every step. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her sharp eyes missed nothing as she approached. Miss Macquie, the woman said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her tone crisp but polite. I'm Eleanor Briggs, the regional manager. I understand there's been some concern about your transaction. Amara met her handshake with equal firmness. Concern, Miss Briggs, is an understatement, she said evenly. I came here to make a deposit. Instead, I've been subjected to delays and unnecessary scrutiny. Is this standard practice at Capital Crest? Eleanor's expression didn't waver, though her jaw tightened slightly. I assure you, we adhere to strict protocols for all large transactions. It's for the protection of our clients and the bank. Protection, Amara repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. I see. And would these protocols apply if I didn't look like I do? The subtle accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face before she recovered. That's not the case, Eleanor said carefully. But if you feel you've been treated unfairly, I'll personally ensure this matter is resolved immediately. Amara studied the woman, noting the practiced neutrality in her expression. She had encountered people like Eleanor before, people who wielded power like a shield, protecting themselves from accountability. "I'd appreciate that," Amara said, her voice calm but firm. "And while you're at it, I'd suggest reviewing your staff's training. It seems some of them could use a refresher on how to treat their clients with respect." Eleanor nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll take that under advisement." Reginald, who had been standing silently to the side, shifted uncomfortably. His face was pale, his usual air of authority diminished in the presence of the two women. "Mr. Thorpe," Eleanor said sharply, turning to him, "process Miss Amaqui's deposit immediately. No further delays." "Yes, ma'am," Reginald said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he hurried back to his station, Amara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She watched as he carefully entered the details into the system, his hands trembling slightly as he printed the receipt. When he finally handed it to her, she took it without a word, her fingers brushing his briefly. His hand was clammy, his gaze avoiding hers. "Thank you," Amara said, her tone polite but laced with an unmistakable edge. She turned back to Eleanor. "I trust there won't be any more concerns the next time I visit." "Of course not, Miss Amaqui," Eleanor said. "You have my assurance." With a curt nod, Amara tucked the receipt into her bag and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room as she exited, but she didn't look back. In the privacy of her car, a sleek black SUV parked in the reserved lot, Amara allowed herself a moment to exhale. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her grip tightening as the tension of the encounter slowly ebbed away. "They'll learn," she thought, her resolve hardening. "They'll all learn." Reaching for her phone, she dialed a familiar number. "Miss Amaqui," came the smooth voice of her assistant, Tobias, on the other end. "Tobias," she said, "schedule a meeting with the board for tomorrow. We need to discuss staff retraining at Capital Crest." "Understood," Tobias replied without hesitation. "And one more thing," Amara added, her voice steely. "Make sure Reginald Thorpe's name is on the agenda." "Consider it done." As she ended the call, Amara gazed out the windshield at the city skyline. The encounter at the bank was just another reminder of the battles she had fought and would continue to fight. But she hadn't come this far to be underestimated. Not now. Not ever. The boardroom of Samaqui Holdings was a stark contrast to the bustling bank floor Amara had walked into the day before. The walls were lined with sleek, minimalist artwork, and the long glass table gleamed under the soft overhead lighting. It was a room designed to command respect, a physical manifestation of the empire Amara had built from the ground up. Amara stood at the head of the table, her tailored cream blazer and matching wide-legged trousers exuding authority. Tobias sat to her right, his tablet poised on the table, ready to take notes. Around them, the board members shifted in their seats, some sipping coffee, others scanning the agenda displayed on the screens embedded in the table. Amara allowed the room to settle before she began. She didn't need to demand attention. Her presence alone commanded it. "Thank you all for being here this morning," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "As you've seen on the agenda, we'll be discussing several updates today. However, I want to begin with a matter that cannot wait. The culture within our recent acquisition, Capital Crest Bank." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The members exchanged glances, some leaning back as if bracing themselves for what was to come. "Yesterday, I experienced firsthand a concerning lack of professionalism at one of our branches," Amar continued. "An employee, without just cause, questioned my identity, delayed my transaction, and treated me as though I didn't belong in the very institution I own." Her words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the room. "And let me be clear," she added, her eyes sweeping across the table. "This wasn't just a matter of poor customer service. This was indicative of a deeper issue, a culture of bias and disrespect that I will not tolerate." Tobias tapped a button on his tablet, and the room's central screen lit up with images of employee training statistics, customer feedback, and policy reports from Capital Crest. According to the data, Tobias began, his voice measured. Complaints regarding implicit bias and discriminatory behavior at Capital Crest branches are 27% higher than the industry average. While these issues predate our acquisition, they now fall under our responsibility. The murmurs returned, louder this time. A few board members nodded in agreement, while others scribbled notes or scrolled through their own devices. Amara let the noise simmer for a moment before raising a hand to quiet the room. "This isn't just a PR issue," she said. "It's a moral one. If we claim to be a company that values diversity, equity, and inclusion, then we need to back those words with action." A hand went up at the far end of the table. It belonged to George Paxton, a graying man with a penchant for questioning decisions that disrupted the status quo. "Miss Amakwe," George began, adjusting his glasses, "while I agree that this incident is regrettable, do you believe it warrants such a comprehensive review? After all, isolated incidents." "This wasn't isolated," Amara interjected, her tone sharp enough to cut him off but not impolite. "And even if it were, one incident is one too many. Our employees represent this company. When they falter, it reflects on all of us." George leaned back, chastened but not entirely convinced. Tobias leaned forward, picking up the thread. "We've outlined a proposal for mandatory bias training across all Capital Crest branches. Additionally, we're suggesting a restructuring of the performance review process to include metrics on employee conduct and customer satisfaction." "And what about accountability?" Amara asked, directing the question at the table. "It's not enough to train people if there are no consequences for failing to meet our standards." A younger board member, Nadia Singh, chimed in. "Accountability measures could include immediate disciplinary actions for discriminatory behavior up to and including termination. We could also implement anonymous reporting systems to encourage transparency without fear of retaliation." Amara nodded approvingly. "Good. Let's refine these measures and have a finalized plan by the end of the week." The discussion continued, diving into logistics, timelines, and potential pushback. Through it all, Amara remained steadfast, guiding the conversation with precision and authority. By the time the meeting adjourned, a clear path forward had been established. Later that afternoon, Amara returned to her office. The corner suite, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic view of the city, was both a sanctuary and a command center. She sank into her leather chair, the weight of the morning's discussions pressing lightly on her shoulders. Tobias entered moments later, carrying a tray with 2 cups of herbal tea. "You handled that well," he said, setting one cup on her desk. "Thank you," Amara replied, though her voice carried a hint of fatigue. He hesitated, then added, "Reginald Thorpe's name has been flagged for further review, as you requested. Human Resources will handle the details, but it might be worth considering whether you want to address him directly." Amara sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her as she considered the suggestion. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Sometimes a direct approach makes a stronger impression." Tobias nodded and left her to her thoughts. Amara leaned back, her gaze drifting to the skyline. This wasn't just about fixing one bank branch or disciplining one employee. It was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that no one, whether customer, employee, or executive, was ever made to feel as though they didn't belong. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. It was a text from Eleanor Briggs, the regional manager from the branch. "Miss Amakwe, I'd like to formally apologize for yesterday's incident. I'd also appreciate the opportunity to discuss how we can improve moving forward. Please let me know if you're available for a call." Amara stared at the message for a moment before typing a response. "Eleanor, I appreciate your apology. Let's schedule a call for tomorrow morning. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can create meaningful change." Hitting send, she set the phone down and let out a breath. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen. She would make sure of it. The main conference room at Samakwe Holdings buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was occupied, from board members to regional managers of Capital Crest Bank, alongside representatives from HR and customer relations. Amara Samakwi stood at the head of the room, her presence commanding and calm, a quiet power that silenced the chatter as soon as she entered. It had been 6 months since the incident at the branch. 6 months of rigorous reform, retraining, and rebuilding trust, not just with customers but within the company itself. Amara's hands-on approach had shaken the foundations of Capital Crest, demanding accountability at every level. Amara began the meeting with a soft smile, her hands clasped on the table. "Before we dive into the progress report," she said, her voice steady, "I want to acknowledge the collective effort that has brought us to this point. Change is never easy, but the results we've achieved together are a testament to what's possible when we commit to doing better." A round of applause rippled through the room, but Amara raised a hand to settle the energy. "Now, let's talk about the numbers," she continued, gesturing to Tobias, who stood to present. Tobias tapped the screen, displaying a series of graphs. Customer satisfaction at Capital Crest branches has risen by 38%. Employee retention rates have improved significantly, and anonymous feedback indicates a marked reduction in reports of discriminatory behavior. A murmur of approval swept the room. Tobias smiled as he added, "And for those who like direct comparisons, our competitors are still trailing by an average of 20% in these same metrics." Amara leaned back slightly, a small glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Impressive, but numbers are only part of the story. Eleanor, could you share your perspective?" Eleanor Briggs, now the regional director for Capital Crest, stood. Her once reserved demeanor had given way to a newfound confidence, a direct result of Amara's mentorship. "Thank you, Miss Amakwi," Eleanor began. "When we first implemented these changes, there was resistance, understandably so. But as we began to see the impact, not just on our customers but on our employees, the skepticism turned into pride. People are proud to be part of Capital Crest again." She paused, looking around the room. "The biggest lesson I've learned through this process is that accountability and compassion aren't opposites. They're complementary. And when we lead with both, we can create spaces where everyone feels they belong." Another round of applause followed, this one louder, more heartfelt. A meeting of paths. Later that evening, Amara visited the very branch where it had all begun. The building had undergone a transformation. Brighter lighting, modern furniture, and a welcoming atmosphere that now matched the bank's stated values. As she entered, a familiar figure approached, Reginald Thorpe. "Miss Amakwi," he said, his voice steady but tinged with humility. He wore a new name badge indicating his role as a branch compliance officer, a position that Amara had personally recommended after reviewing his case. "Mr. Thorpe," she replied, her tone neutral but not unkind. "How are things here?" "Better," he said, meeting her gaze. "Much better. I've learned a lot these past months. About myself, about what it means to serve people with dignity." Amara nodded, sensing the sincerity in his words. "Good. Growth isn't easy, but it's worth it." He hesitated, then added, "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on this place or on me. You could have written us off, but you didn't." Amara's expression softened. "Everyone deserves the opportunity to grow, Mr. Thorpe. What matters is what you do with that opportunity." The legacy continues. Months turned into years, and Capital Crest Bank became a model for corporate accountability and inclusivity, a transformation that industry analysts hailed as groundbreaking. Amara's name became synonymous with integrity and visionary leadership, but for her, the true victory was more personal. She didn't need accolades. She needed to know that she had built something enduring, something that would continue to challenge the status quo long after she was gone. One day, as she walked through the bustling lobby of Samakwi Holdings, she overheard a conversation between two employees. "She's a legend, isn't she?" "Yeah, but you know what's really inspiring? She doesn't just lead, she listens." Amara smiled to herself as she stepped into her private elevator. She had faced prejudice, doubt, and resistance, but she had turned every challenge into an opportunity. And in doing so, she had not only changed a bank, but had also redefined what leadership could look like. The door slid shut, and Amara leaned against the cool metal wall, closing her eyes for a moment of reflection. Her journey wasn't over. There were always more battles to fight, more barriers to break. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she had left an indelible mark on a world that had once underestimated her.